All right, hello, and welcome to the day after the exam. Hopefully you're well rested. Hopefully you probably care a lot less about the exam by now. But if you are still interested, we are going to start breaking down question 2 of the 2021 BCAR economics exam. This is a big boy question. It's 25 marks. There's a whole lot of in-depth budgetary policy stuff here, both from the aggregate demand side and aggregate supply side. We'll get into it. We'll break it down as quickly as possible, just where I think the marks are, what you hopefully need to do, and what you hopefully did do. And then we'll be fine. Hopefully then I'll be back later today with question 3 and maybe question 4. Then we'll be completely done and you don't have to worry about it ever again to get your scores. So roll into question 1. Question 1, something we talked about a lot in the lead up to the exam. Throwing a little bit of recent in it too, which is very, very nice. So explain the likely effect of the government's forecast budget outcome for 2021-2022 on the level of government and public debt. So you'd have to talk about what the planned outcome is. So the forecast outcome, and what the actual one is. So knowing the data here is actually useful. On the level of government public debt, very, very important thing when talking about the government or public debt, that you are talking about essentially what the government owes overseas, and as well as the private sector. So it's not just overseas debt, it's both within the country and overseas. So explain the likely effect of the forecast outcome. So being able to say that it's going to be a budget deficit forecast for $103.3 billion. Saying that an expansionary budget deficit, great too, for the 2021-2022. Knowing that is great. So obviously then, because of this significant, meaning that the outlays obviously outweigh revenues, so outlays exceed revenues. And obviously that means they need to do some form of borrowing to fund that, and that's going to increase the level of government and public debt. So government public debt is all of the money both the government owes to both the private sector and overseas and the RBA, because obviously they are the three channels they can borrow from. So if there is a deficit, it means it's going to increase the level of government or public debt. So increase public debt via, and then you talk about the options that they can do, because they're either going to borrow or sell government bonds from RBA, private sector, or overseas. And that's obviously going to be through selling government securities or bonds. Saying that it's going to increase public debt is important, but making sure that you mention that it's not just from overseas, because a lot of students are going to lose out there because I get fixated on the fact that when the government has a budget deficit, they're borrowing from overseas. Therefore, there's more foreign debt, which technically they might do some of that. What's their preferred option? Hopefully, then they're going to be borrowing from the RBA and private sector, and that's going to increase the level of public debt. So doing those things, talking about the expansionary budget deficit, the figure is going to make your answer look amazing. You don't need to have it exact. If you're close to the number, they're probably going to give you the mark. Saying that a deficit is where outlays exceed revenues, that kind of like emphasizes the budget outcome. And then talking about that level of public debt. So the level of public debt increasing and why that would happen. So where they're potentially borrowing from. So being really specific about that, what that public debt is, will get you that 3 marks. So essentially 1 mark for talking about the forecast budget outcome, and then 2 marks for the specific effect on public debt would be my feelings about that question. Then question B, a massive 8 marker. This one's weird in that it's not the traditional 4 marks for each thing when they talk about 2 concepts. So if we were to look at this, and we are to start getting my highlighting going, and with respect to budgetary policy, explain the difference. So essentially distinguish between the role of automatic and discretionary stabilizers. So already at the start of the question, one of the first things you're going to be doing is distinguish between automatic and discretionary. So that's going to be saying what each of them are and pointing out the clear difference between them. If that was a distinguished question, that's probably going to be 3 marks straight away, but I'm guessing it's probably going to be around 2-ish here. We'll get into why that is in a second. So distinguishing first in how they influence aggregate demand and stabilize the business cycle. And then use an example of each type of stabilizer that may have operated over the past 2 years, support your explanation. So there's a lot going on there in that you need 3 examples, realistically, or two, really, you could use one automatic stabilizer and one discretionary, but with automatic stabilizers, I always feel it's best to talk about both the change in tax revenue and the change in welfare outlays. But there's a lot to do here. So saying what automatic stabilizers are and how they work to countercyclically to stabilize the business cycle. So you'll be talking about, hopefully you would have gone with during any of the lockdowns where unemployment starts to rise, which means that welfare outlays increase and tax revenues decrease automatically. Then you talk about how this aims to maintain incomes and aggregate demand and stabilize the business cycle through there. So that's going to be what you're talking about with automatic stabilizers. You'd specifically use your example of during the pandemic as people became unemployed, as businesses closed down through lockdowns. This meant a lot of people moved from a working income onto transfer payments, just maintain their income, and therefore they were able to keep spending and maintain aggregate demand in that way. They were also paying less tax as they moved onto a transfer income, which decreased the amount of tax revenue by the government. Same kind of deal, less leakages from aggregate demand, more likely to maintain aggregate demand and move us out of that contraction, hopefully into an expansionary phase. So that's going to be one part. So talking about your automatic stabilizers, you're going to get 4 marks of the question in talking about that with your example in really, really strong detail. Then your next one's going to come from discretionary stabilizers, being any deliberate changes by the government to budgetary policy in aiming to stabilize or stimulate aggregate demand or slow it down, depending on the case. And you can use any deliberate change. I would have gone with like the, you could have used job seeker, you could have used, technically you could use job keeper, you could have used, I'd probably use the $1,080 tax offset for low and middle income earners. So low middle income tax offset, how that aims to increase private consumption spending and therefore increase aggregate demand and therefore helps to stabilize the business cycle. Really, really specific real world example to help strengthen that answer. Realistically, if you talk about both things well with an example, it's a really, really achievable 8-mark question. It's just what it needs to be a really high quality answer is using those specific examples and making sure that when you talk about automatic stabilizers, you're saying they occur automatically and not saying the government changes anything, because that will make that part incorrect. Then we've got describe one strength and one weakness of the operation of the government's budgetary policy in either 2020 or 2021 in stabilizing aggregate demand and achieving the government's domestic macroeconomic goal of strong sustainable economic growth. So a bit there, the upside of either 2020 or 2021 gives you a bit of flexibility in talking about strength and weakness. Hopefully for your strength you went for can target specific sectors. So you could have really, really clearly honed in on how they can do that and how that would then help to achieve, like, stabilize aggregate demand. So if you went with giving more, like you could have gone with the using the example of the low and middle income tax offset again, and how that aims to increase private consumption spending and therefore increase AD and send a signal to producers to increase production. And therefore that's going to make it more likely that we achieve strong sustainable economic growth because there is more aggregate demand, etc. So it's really, really targeting lower middle income earners, giving them more of a disposable income is obviously going to have a really, really great effect. You'd also ideally define the domestic goal of strong sustainable economic growth at some point, and you talk about moving towards that goal, helping to achieve it or not. If you know in 2021, you could even then mention how it got us out of that negative growth from 2020 and moved us into that 9.6% growth that we currently have, which has bounced back from that. So that's what I talked about in the strength. So you're going to get 1 mark for saying the specific strength and weakness and then going into how that strength or weakness impacted aggregate demand and therefore the goal of strong sustainable economic growth. Then for the next 3 marks of it, you had a weakness of budgetary policy. The weaknesses are a little bit like weird at the moment in that the weakness of budgetary policy are a bit vague. I usually just still stick with political bias in that some policies set by the government, and you could give any kind of example, may have vested political interest and therefore not benefit society as well as possible. Because you could use JobKeeper as an example here. You don't need examples here either. I always tend to use them if they help strengthen the answer. You could have gone without this, but with JobKeeper, a lot of businesses that were still profitable were receiving subsidies from the government, even though they weren't either. And even some businesses were receiving JobKeeper and not actually producing it, was motivating them to not have to change whatever. And therefore, because the government is very pro-business in this case and have a bias towards them, by doing that, it prevented them from being able to increase production, and therefore, so it didn't increase production, and therefore it's less likely that strong sustainable economic growth is going to be achieved. I can also talk about political hurdles, well, that some policy need to be voted on, etc. But it's kind of difficult in those ways at the moment. If you had an idea of a better weakness, let me know. I haven't gone too in depth into this. I could have gone back over a few things and gone into more detail, but I think political bias could work well if you explain it really well. Then we've got, in really, really blurry, apologies for the scan here, explain one of the following aspects of Australia's government budgetary policy, how it might influence aggregate supply and the achievement of the goal of low inflation. So the upside with this, it's just theoretical. So how any of these policies would affect aggregate supply and the achievement of the goal of low inflation. You don't need examples with it, which is kind of amazing. I'd still probably include it in a 4-mark answer, but you could go with any of these 3 options. So if you're spinning on either way, you're going to probably describe it first, what it is. Then probably, I would say, I would include an example anyway, because it's going to strengthen your answer, and then go into how that increases efficiency or cost of production, or lowers cost of production, so increases efficiency or decreases cost of production, and then how that then increases aggregate supply. So spending on education and training, you talk about the Job Trainer program, which aims to upskill unemployed workers in areas of skill shortages. That works to make a more productive workforce as they're more employable, which is going to increase our productive capacity and make us more able to produce. Therefore, that's going to increase aggregate supply. Research and development grants, you can talk about how the fact that that motivates businesses to conduct research and development spending, such as the 45% tax offset for businesses to conduct that. That may lead to technological advances or new production techniques that are going to increase our efficiencies because we're going to get more output per unit of input and therefore increase our production and aggregate supply overall. Subsidies, you could talk about, and you've got it then linked to the goal of low inflation too. So obviously, I missed that bit. It's going to decrease cost inflation in any case because they're going to have lower cost of production as businesses are more profitable and therefore more likely to achieve. Because that's going to stop any like painful inflationary pressures. And then for lastly, subsidies, payments to businesses in this case, to motivate them to produce in a certain way. You use JobKeeper as an example, and that lowers cost of production for businesses, therefore they can pass on those savings to consumers, and they're more motivated to want to produce if they have a lower cost of production, therefore increasing aggregate supply, lowering cost inflation, more likely to achieve the goal of low inflation, being that the general level of prices are rising at a rate of 2 to 3% on average over time. Because it wasn't recent, you didn't have to tie that into where we are right now with inflation. So you could have, but that would probably make it a bit more difficult to answer as clearly. And then finally, one example of either tax reform policy or a welfare reform policy that's been implemented and how this policy might influence both aggregate supply and material living standards. So whichever one you choose, I'll give a little bit of a description of it first. So what tax reform or welfare reform is. One example of it being you need to actually say one that exists. So with tax reform, I'd probably go the lower middle income tax offset. So that $1,080 that they can offset and the impact that has, that's going to increase motivation to work and make people want to return to the labour force if they are not. That's going to increase our productivity. And therefore increase aggregate supply. Also, in this case, if people are more motivated to work and more productive, it should lead to more employment and higher incomes, therefore increasing material living standards as well. With welfare reform policy, you could talk about the fact that job seeker reverting back to almost near its initial levels. Obviously, that's going to motivate people to return to the workplace, to increase motivation to return to the labor force, which is going to follow through the same logic. As they become employed, they're receiving a working income, which is going to increase their material living standards overall. So getting to that point will be fine there. And that's it for question 2. It's a bit of a long one. It's a big question with 25 marks worth of stuff. If you have any questions about any of it or anything that you've said, if you've said something different to me and you want some clarification of if you're on the right track, just let me know and I'll let you know what I think of what you've said. You've probably forgotten by now, and that's totally fine. If you want to hang around and see question 3 and question 4 broken down, I will be back to do that later today. Thank you for watching this stuff. Thank you for watching stuff all year long. I really hope that you did as well as you hope to. On that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you later. Bye.